So we're on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Beis, and we're hoping to get to the Mishnah, maybe a little bit beyond the Mishnah today. And let's see where we begin. There are two dots, approximately maybe 11 lines down from the top. And you'll see after the two dots, the words haragtiv, and then it says v'chulei haragnuhu tinase. And this is the Shita quoted in our Mishnah in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, and he makes the following distinction. If the witness comes in and says, I killed your husband, then Rabbi Yehuda's Shita is he's not believed. On the other hand, he says that we killed, in the royal we killed your husband, then he is believed. And the Gemara is going to try to work very hard to justify that distinction. And the Rabbanan, as we discussed yesterday, are of the opinion that we do believe him, even if he says, I killed him. You know, he identifies himself by his own admission as the murderer. And the Gemara says that's Shita the Rabbanan is based on the principle of Rava, that Adam Karavetz al Atzmo, and Ein Adam Meis Matzon Rosh, that a person is not believed to incriminate himself. However, we could accept what he says about someone else. Like, for example, if he says, Ploni Ravani Lirtzoni, we don't believe that it was Lirtzono. We do a Palgin and Dibura job, and we only accept his testimony vis-a-vis the Roveh. And the Gemara suggested that perhaps Rabbi Yehuda should be aligned with the Shita of Rabbi Nasha. Rabbi Nasha, on the top of Chaf Hey Amud Beis, was quoted as saying that a Gazlan Doraisa is possibly a Isha, which sounds like he's rejecting the principle of Palgina Dibura, meaning if we can identify Rabbi Menashe with Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Menashe is an Amora, but with the Tana Rabbi Yehuda, by combining those two shitas together, what we're saying is that when a person testifies that I killed your husband, we're not going to allow him to, we're not going to allow anyone to marry him. We're not going to rely on that edus. Just like Rabbi Menashe says, the Gazlan Doraisa is not Neman Beidus Isha. So there are no special kulas in Eidus Isha. According to Rabbi Menashe, we really need full-fledged kosher edus, a reliable edus that qualifies as edus. A posel, for example, a Gazlan Doraisa is excluded from edus even in the case of Isha. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda, who did not accept the principle of Palgina Dibura, then by his own admission, the one who says Raktiv is a Rasha, and therefore he cannot be a qualified witness, and therefore we cannot allow her to marry someone else. And the Gemara tried to say that Rabbi Nasha is not committed to accept Rabbi Yehuda. He can accept the Chachamim because he might adopt the principle of Rav of Palgin and Dibura. If you have an already established apostle, we have long ago we've established this person as a Gazlan. We have clear-cut evidence and testimony against him that he's a no good thief. Then we cannot accept his aidus in a court of law, and certainly we cannot allow her to marry someone else. But in the case of a person who says haraktiv, and we don't believe him to say haraktiv and be marshias esatzpo, therefore we can accept his testimony. Mishu, is okay to sit there, or you can move the table or move the chair. You'll make yourself comfortable. Take a Coke if you like.
Yeah, right.
Right.
It's a long day.
Let's see if you can. I would maybe suggest moving this table a little bit out. Have a little bit more breathing room.
Wow.
So we are now on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Beis, approximately 11 lines down from the top in our Gemara. I assume it's similar to your Gemara. And you're looking for a quote from the Mishnah, Haragtiv. See if you can find such a thing on Daf Chafayim and Beis. You have it? So again, we're just reviewing so we can have an easy takeoff on the Gemara that we want to study now. Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, and it's no surprise, actually it's almost intuitive. His ruling is that if a man testifies about an Ashes Ish, that her husband was murdered, and not only was he murdered, but he was murdered by me myself. You know what I mean? So Rabbi Yehuda says we cannot accept his testimony and allow her to get married when he, by his own admission, by his own confession, is a no good murderer, and certainly he's a Russian Posliavis. But the Gemara says that the Rabbanon didn't accept this position of Rabbi Yehuda because they operated with a principle which is called Ein Adam Osa Atzmo Rosh. Ein Adam Osa Atzmo Rosh. That's the Gemara that we did yesterday, but it's very important that we review this, because what's happening is then that Rabbi Yehuda, when he says that her active is not believed, he's not accepting this principle of Ein Adam Marshias Atzmo, Ein Adam Osa Atzmo Rosh. He's saying that, look, either you accept his entire testimony or reject his testimony. There's no way you can pick and choose and say, well, yeah, I believe that this guy was killed, but not by the witness who's testifying that he. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda rejects the principle called Algina Dibura. We'll pick and choose and we'll accept his edus relative to X and not relative to Y. As far as his edus on the dead body, well, we don't have the dead body, but on the so-called deceased, who was murdered, that will accept his testimony. But we're not going to accept his testimony when he says, I killed him. Rabbi Yehuda never would go that far. And the Gemara assumes that Rabbi Yehuda is reflected in a later sheet, Rabbi Yehuda Zatana, of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef is the one who says that if a person says, Ploni Ravani Lirtzoni, and there are two parts to his testimony. He's testifying on the Rovea, and he's testifying on himself that he's the Nirva. If he's the Nirva and he says Lirtzoni, then by definition he's a Russian. So Rabbi Yosef throws out his edus. We can't even consider him one of two witnesses. He's completely disqualified. And once again, it seems that Rabbi Yosef rejected this principle of Hagina Dibura. We're not going to allow to pick and choose and say, well, we believe you as far as the Rovea is concerned, and you're a qualified witness against the Rovea, but we don't believe you when you add the fact that you're the Nirva, you're the Russian. And if we link that up with Rabbi Yehuda, who says her active is not believed, and therefore we're not going to allow this woman to get married because Rabbi Yehuda rejects Palgin and Dibura, and then we have a nice, alignment here between the Shita of Rabbi Yosef, the latest Shita, and the earliest Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says the following, that, Rabbi Yosef might say that you're right. As a general rule, we're not going to apply Palgin and Dibura. But I still could accept the Chachamim of Rabbi Yehuda. What does that mean? That means that we have a certain halachic area which defies, so to speak, or breaks loose out of the bounds of edus. It's not bound and restricted by the conditions for edus. And that's called aguna, otherwise known as edus isha, meaning when it comes to a married woman and we're trying to clarify through evidence that her husband is dead and therefore should get remarried, we bend over backwards. We have a certain flexibility. And in that case, when a person says her active, even without Palgin and Dibura, we're going to accept the testimony of a Russian. Could you imagine? And therefore, he is believed to establish the death of this woman's husband, such that now we can allow her to get married. And even though Rav Yosef, in general, rejects Palgin and Dibura, so Ploni Ravani Lirtzoni is not believed, because by his own admission he's a Rasha. But in the case of Edus Isha, Rabbi Yosef might argue, let's accept the Chachamim Shita and be more lenient and rely on the testimony of someone who is technically disqualified from testimony. Now, in a sense, this is going to have an impact on our other discussion, so which I'm going to try to clue you in on this, and that has to do with Rav Menashe. Rav Menashe is the top line on Chafei and Beis. And Rav Menashe went on record as saying that we don't have any leniencies with regard to Eidus Isha. And if we have an established Gazlan, that means in the past he embezzled money, and we've actually clarified that beyond the shadow of a doubt with pure, reliable evidence, then we cannot accept him to testify about a woman's husband that he died. So that there's no room for flexibility, since Rav Menashe, once having established a psul, will reject that Eidus and disqualify it, even in the case of Eidus Isha. Then we can link up Rav Menashe with Rabbi Yehuda. Right? Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said that we don't accept Palgin and Dibur. And if a man says Raktiv, it's an all or nothing proposition. If we take his entire Eidus as one entity, then by definition, his own confession incriminates him, and therefore we cannot accept his Eidus. And that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, even in the case of Eidus Isha. We have no flexibility, no tolerance for Eidus Isha to go beyond the strictures and the requirements and conditions of Eidus in general. So Eidus Isha, like Eidus in general, we don't accept Palgin and Dibur according to Rabbi Yehuda. And now the Gemara is saying that Rav Menashe will also apply the universal rules that govern Eidus to the case of Eidus Isha without accepting that Eidus Isha is the exception to the rule. Hence, if we've already established him as a Gazlan, then he's possibly Eidus. We cannot accept him, even in Eidus Isha. Now we go on to the next Gemara, which is our new Gemara for today. Adkan, we just reviewed what we did yesterday. In the new Gemara, we're faced with a real difficult problem, because Rabbi Yehuda, although he doesn't accept the Eidus of a person who says Raktiv, I was the murderer, he does accept the Eidus when he says Haragnuhu, meaning I was part of like a group of mafioso that put this guy, we rubbed him out, right? So the Gemara immediately asks, Maishna Haraktiv, Maishna Hargunu. To the same extent that in the case of Haraktiv, by his own confession, he is a Rasha, and therefore we have to reject his Eidus. Rabbi Yehuda never accepted the principle of Palgin and Dibura, nor did he accept a Kula with regard to Eidus Isha, and the general requirements and conditions for Eidus in general apply to Eidus Isha as well. So what about the case of Hagnu? Even in the case of Hagnu, he's admitting that he was part of the group of people that put this guy to death. That makes him into a Russian. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to rewrite the Mishnah. It doesn't mean Haragnuhu, but the Omer, what did he testify? Ani hayisi im hargav. I was amongst the people in that group that I called the mafioso clique, but I didn't press the trigger. He was killed by one of the other members of our group. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda would have to admit in this case that his testimony is reliable, because he is not disqualified under the category of Russia by virtue of his own admission, because he's not admitting that he killed the guy. Maybe he would have killed the guy, but somebody killed him before he killed him. I don't know. But anyway, he's not a Russian. He was not responsible for this murder. And the Gemara now, you see the next word in the Gemara is Vatanya. Did you notice that? In 90% of the cases, the word Vatanya means, and I'll ask you a question from a contradictory price. Here, this belongs to what I call the 10% exception, where the word Vatanya means, I'll prove it to you from a price. Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda, the Chachamim turned to Rabbi Yehuda with the following story. Maisa, Belistim Echad, Sheyotza lehareg b'megizas kaputkia. Now, what happened was that let's give him a name. I don't want to give him a Jewish name. let's give him a non-Jewish name for the time being, even though I'm sure he's Jewish. But he's a mafioso guy. Well, what should we call him? John. Okay, we'll call him John. Now, John was condemned to death as a listed. And now, as he's being taken out to the guillotine, the decapitated, or whatever they do there in the Achol Shalaka, whenever they put someone to death, on his way out there, in a place called Megizas Kaputkia, Amar Lahem, he tells the rest of his gang, Lechu imru la, please convey a message. The H.S. Shimon ben Cohen, Ani haragti es bala, b'knisasi l'lud. I'm not going to tell you that this is pshat, but my heart tells me that this guy had hirure tshuva. Do you follow what I mean? He's on his way to capital punishment, and on his way, he wants to notify a certain woman that she could get married because I murdered your husband. Right? His name was Shimon ben Cohen. He tells you exactly where he murdered him. That's the first list we marked. When I came into Lud, on the entryway to Lud, that's where I rubbed them out. But Amalei, there's another version that B'knisa Sol Lud, when Shimon ben Cohen entered into the city of Lud, I shot him. I put an arrow through his. And in that Maisa, he siu as Ishto. They relied on the edus of this guy who's a no good listim, who's about to be decapitated, when he says, I killed your husband by the name of Shimon ben Cohen. So the Chachamim therefore prove that we will rely on someone who's as bad as a listim. He's a real Rasha, he's a murderer, and he testifies that he murdered this man. We're going to rely on his testimony to allow her, the Halmana, to get remarried. Amalahem, so Rabbi Yehuda responds to Rabbanan, Misham Raya, question mark, rhetorical question. The Omar Ani Yisim Hargov. It's not a case where he's saying and admitting that he killed the guy, Shimon ben Cohen, but rather he's saying that I was there, present, when your husband, Shimon, was murdered. And therefore, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree, and that comes under the case of Haragnuhu, which means Ani Hayisim Hargov, that he's not condemning himself. We can accept his edus. And relying on his edus, we can be matir her to get married to someone else. Now, let's just clarify this for a second. On whose edus are we relying? On the edus of a listim who's about to be beheaded for his terrible, record, his criminal record. I think that's the Gemara's kashi. Well, listim kitani. In other words, they're taking this guy out to be killed because of his status as listim. Apparently, there are witnesses that testify that he was now. Again, you know the difference between listim and a regular thief?
He's on.
Right, exactly. He's on. So these are killers. We're not talking about thieves, petty thieves that'll pickpocket. We're talking about those guys in the Western movies, that would shoot you up if you don't give them your money. So this guy is being put to death. Apparently, there's testimony that he is a murderer. How then could we trust him as a witness when he is a murderer? A murderer is your classic case of someone who is a Rasha, and therefore, ipso facto, he is disqualified for testimony. Now, I feel that this Gemara's kasha is not a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda, it's a kasha on the whole story. Right? According to the Chacham, okay, we're going to rely on Palgin and Dibur. But here you can't say Palgin and Dibura. I mean, the guy himself is a Russian. He's a murderer. So the Gemara says, Shenitfas al Yidei Listius. He's only suspected of being an armed robber. Why? Because he hangs out with the other armed robbers. He's part of the gang. Right? This is like West Side Story kind of thing. He's part of the gang. And by implication, we assume he's a murderer. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? You assume he's a murderer. We're taking him out to the guillotine. He must have been proven and established with clear evidence that he is a murderer. How then can we trust him to testify that her husband Shimon ben Kohen died? And the Gemara answers, yeah, he was Yotzei Liharik, but not in a Jewish court, but Beidina Diovei Kol Chavin. In a non-Jewish court, below Daike, the Katl. Now again, we can translate this Gemara literally. I think we would do more justice to the Gemara with can I use the term, a more liberal translation? But literally it means lo daiki, that they don't clarify. Someone who's not medayik means he doesn't look for evidence. He doesn't establish the truth. I'm not sure if that's what the Gemara means. Maybe what the Gemara means is that the non-Jewish courts don't have the same standards of evidence that we have in our Jewish courts. For example, yesterday we mentioned halacha of Moshe v'Aaron. And Moshe v'Aaron, two brothers, come to testify. They're the most trustworthy guys, and yet we cannot accept their edus. Or a melech, for example, is possibly edus. Edus miyuchedes, they saw from two different vantage points, and they don't know about each other. So therefore, Katolik. So again, he was Yotzei Lihare, but that doesn't mean that the evidence was absolutely clear and convincing that he was a murderer. And therefore, the Jewish court of law, he still has what's called a cheskas kashrus. You're innocent until proven guilty, and we don't have a proof that he's guilty just because the goyim have decided that he should be put to death. And I would add again another emotional point there. If he's a Jew, that's what we're talking about, because we're relying on his aids. Right. Then, I don't know, the goyim might have looked for some sort of excuse to put him to death, not relying on the best interests. I can tell you what my father told me about his youth back in Lithuania. He said, for a guy to kill a Jew was nothing. Less din, less dying. There was no one to appeal to. So in other words, the bottom line is that Rabbi Yehuda only accepts the testimony of Haragtiv when the man's, Haragnuhu, when the man is saying, I was there when he was put to death. But if he would testify that I put him to death, I was the murderer, then Rabbi Yehuda would certainly reject that edus, even as far as edus isha is concerned. But the case of the Masechet Yevamot Echad, who on his way to be killed, tell the story, there it was a case of Omer Ani Ha'isim Hargov. You'll say, even Ani Ha'isim Hargov, how can we rely on his testimony? He's certainly a Rosh, he's a Rotzach. The answer is that he's being executed in a non-Jewish court, and their standards of evidence are not the same as ours. Therefore, he still has a cheskes kashrus, and we can rely on his edus. Okay, now we're up to the Mishnah. So again, we're continuing on the vein of what we call lazus fasayim. You remember that concept of lazus fasayim? That if we're going to allow someone to marry a woman who was married, and it looks like everything that he said was because he wanted to marry her, then we're not going to allow him to marry. We want to avoid lazus fasayim. Hechacham. Now, what does it mean, a chacham? Chacham obviously translates as a wise person, but here we're talking about the laws of nidarim. A chacham, when that term is used in context of hafaras nidarim, it has a very specific meaning. Normally, if I take a neder and I want to be mefer the neder, I have to show up in front of a tribunal of 3 members. But there is someone called a chacham who is as weighty or as powerful, if you will, as 3 members of a bezdin. He's a yachid, he's alone, but yet he has the same authority as if he were 3 dayan. So that's called a chacham. Now, the chacham has his authority in Nidarim is a 2-edged sword. What I mean is, what we said before is lekula, that we can rely on him to be mefer neder, and we validate and recognize his hafaras Nidarim, even though he's a yachid. Now we're going to turn it the other way around. He has authority lechumra. What does it mean lechumra? Let's say a person took a neder, and he comes in front of the chacham, and he says to the chacham, "I want out. You know, this is not my cup of tea. Just be made for my neder." The chacham, because of his special status, he has a right to say, "Look, there's no ample raglayim, there's no ample basis for being made for your neder." Hafaras Nidarim requires one of 2 things. It requires either what's called a pesach or a charata. So let's just go over this. Charata means, you know what? I'm suffering from this neder and I can't take it anymore. It's too hard for me. Pesach means that something happened, and as a result of that, if I would have anticipated, if I only would have known from the get-go that this would occur, I never would have taken the neder. That's called a Pesach. Pesach in general is much more reliable in hafaras Nidarim than charata, because in charata he's not denying that he took a neder he wouldn't smoke. He's not denying that it could have occurred to him that after a while he's dying for a cigarette because he's so addicted. He's just saying, you know what? It's too hard for me. Ani mischari. It's one of the words that we use in Kol Nidra. Right the moment. Pesach is already much more far-reaching. Pesach means, little did I know that if I would take an oath that a neder that I won't eat, that I'll fast on this day, little did I know that day, you know, I took a neder on that every 3rd Monday in the month I will fast. Little did I know that my granddaughter's bat mitzvah would be on that 3rd Monday. So that's called a Pesach. And now the Chacham is saying that this neder does not lend itself to us. He doesn't have a valid Pesach. He doesn't have a valid charata. Now, she'asar es ha'isha b'neder al baila. So what happens now? It's a marriage relationship, and she takes a neder. And her neder was that she enjoins herself from having any pleasure, any benefit from her husband. I assume she took such a neder in the context of some sort of altercation, some sort of very difficult confrontation between her and her husband. Now, in such a case, this is called a neder beino that affects the marriage, obviously. And the Baal, her husband, has rights of hafara. However, those rights of hafara are limited by the Torah Parshas Matos to what? To Yom Cham'ah. Only on the day that he heard about the neder. If that day passes by and the sun sets, then he no longer has rights to be made for Haned. Now, they come to the Chacham and they ask him to be matir the neder. He couldn't find neither a Pesach nor a Charata to be matir the neder. And therefore, he paskid, that was his final conclusion, that she cannot, or let's say the other way around, her husband, cannot have any benefit from her because of the neder that she took, because the Chacham now is validating the neder. So what did the husband do? He's in a marriage situation where he can't have any benefit whatsoever from his wife. No hanon. He gave her a divorce because the Chacham was oser the neder. He said, look, there's no valid Pesach, there's no valid Karot. Now, after the Baal gives a get, so the Chacham says, I'll marry him. Hareza lo yisa'enu. Again, we have a situation of lazus fasayin, that maybe, why this Chacham couldn't find a Pesach or a Charata is because he was hoping that having, utilizing, flexing his muscle as a Chacham and finalizing the Isser of the Neder, that the Neder is absolutely binding and it's, doesn't lend itself to Heter. He now realizes in advance that his, anticipating the future, that the husband's going to no doubt give a get and he'll step in and marry him. And that's going to create lazus fasayin. People are going to say, well, this whole gerushin was a bluff. It was all based on a false decision, so to speak, in inverted commas, of this Chacham. And the Chacham went out of his way to falsify the truth so that he could have a setup situation that he could marry. All right. Now we're going to talk about what's called the Yisoma Ketana. What's the Yisoma Ketana? A girl who's less than 12, and her father has unfortunately passed on. On a Doraisa level, she can't get married. No way, no how. Even if her brothers or her mother and they all would agree, let's marry her off, they can't do so because the Torah gave explicit and exclusive rights to the father, who's now no longer alive, to marry her off. However, the Rabbanan recognize a Kiddushin, which the Torah did not recognize, in the case of a Yisoma Ketana. Again, Ketana means she's less than what? Less than 12. Who marries her off? Her brother, or another brother, or her mother. And the Rabbanan recognize this marriage, but it's called Kiddushay Miyun. What does Miyun mean? She could just walk out of the marriage at any point. She could say, I don't want to be married to this guy. Again, all this applies only until her 12th birthday. If she remains within the marriage after her 12th birthday, then the marriage becomes Kiddushay Torah because now she's old enough to get married. She doesn't need neither her father, nor her brothers, nor her mother. She can get married on her own. If, on the other hand, she decided to avail herself of the option of miyun before she became 12, she doesn't need a get. She just announces, I don't want to be married to this guy. I want to be able to marry any other man but him. And that miyun, which is supervised by Bezdin, or by a chacham. Now, again, here's another example where one chacham could replace a bezdin as a yachid, and he could validate the miyun. And in this case, I'm going to skip a few words for a minute. Yisa'ena, the chacham who oversaw the miyun, is allowed to marry her. And we don't have lazus vasayan. Mipnei shu bezdin. What does that mean? Mipnei shu bezdin. The first case, the Reisha, he was a bezdin as a yachid to decide that this neder is not subject to Torah because it doesn't lend itself neither to a Pesach nor to Charata. And then we said he's not allowed to marry her after her husband divorced. And yet in the Sefer, the Mishnah says when he is the one who oversees the miyun, then mipnei shehu bezdin, since he can act as a bezdin in order to validate the miyun, he's allowed to marry her. What goes on over here? Okay, we skipped 3 words. Osha cholza b'fanav. Now we're talking about a different case. We're talking about a regular marriage, meaning she's a gedola, and unfortunately her husband died childless, and now she falls for yibum to his brother. And this chacham is now overseeing chalitza, and he is therefore going to validate the chalitza so that she can marry anyone else. And then he comes forward and he wants to marry her. That's okay. He's allowed to marry her. There's no chashad of people going to say, well, he was matir her by overseeing the miyun or the chalitza in order to marry. Mipnei shehu bezdin. So I'm going to just read to you what he says here in the note. And you'll look in we have, Baruch Hashem, 3 different achronim here. Besides the 3 people here, we have Dr. Atzkel, we have Rabbi Masifta, and now we have Rabbi Steinsaltz. We have a bezdin of our own here in this room. You know? But we'll start with the Masifta. The Masifta says that there are 2 other dayanim that are sitting on this bezdin. This is a curve. We were assuming that just like in Nidarim, the status of a chacham is that he could replace the need for another 2 dayanim to make up a tribunal for a bezdin. So too in the cases of miyun and chalitza, he can serve as a yachid. Here he says, Mipnei shehu bezdin, and the word shehu is not referring to the chacham, the way we interpret it. He's basing himself apparently on the Aruch LaNer. Rather, the word hu is referring to the bezdin itself. Hu means in the presence of bezdin. So hu is referring to the chalitza or to the miyun, and it took place in the presence of bezdin. So therefore, in addition to the chacham, there are another 2 dayanim that is sitting together with him on this tribunal. And we're not going to cast a doubt, a chashad, that this whole thing was a bluff and it was a fabrication in order to allow one of them to get married. The other 2 would not have agreed. We don't assume that 3 people on a bezdin would agree to this kind of let's call it a perjury almost, in order to allow one of them to marry. Okay, that's as far as Masifta is concerned. Now, if you could share with me.
He says,
Bivez, not as a bezdin, but in the he is one of the dayanim of the bezdin. Jeff, what do you have?
Nothing.
Nothing, no footnote, no nothing. So how does he, just out of curiosity, how does he translate the words mipnei shehu bezdin? Because maybe from the translation I'll be able to extrapolate. Oh, you're already in the Gemara. I'm looking at the last line of the Mishnah. You're ahead of me.
Part of a base.
That's his translation. Part of a base. No footnote?
Pages not act alone.
Oh. Excellent. Now that's, you can't get more explicit than that. All right, let's look at the Gemara now. Now, the Gemara tries to understand the foul. We said that the reason why in the ratio, we're going back to the ratio now, we're not going to allow the Chacham, after the husband gives a divorce to his wife, to marry this woman, is because the Chacham recognized and validated the neder as a real Isa. But ha'hitira, supposing it in an opposite case, where the Chacham would paskin that the hafaras, that the neder lends itself to hafar. That's called hitira. Then Yisa'ena. And he can marry her. Because again, he's not setting up a situation where the husband would be enticed or influenced to divorce his wife so that he can step in and marry her. On the contrary, he said that the neder is mutter, and therefore they can continue in the normal marriage relationship. Now, if for whatever reason the husband delivers a divorce, he, made that decision, or I'll tell you even better than that, let's say he dropped dead now. So what's the havamina that the Chacham can't marry? So the Gemara asks, wait a minute. If we're talking about a case where the Chacham is operating on his own, right? We said before that a Chacham is like a Yachid, like three members of the Hafaras Nedarim tribunal. Is then I have the following question: Chadmi Matziv Matir. Is one Chacham allowed to be Matir and Neder, which was our premise? The Amar of Chia bar Oven, Amar of Amram, Tana, Hataras Nedarim b'Shlosha. You cannot be Matir and Neder with less than three. The Ella b'Tlasa. It must be a case where they were matir the neder in the presence of three judges, three dayanim. Now, if it's a case of three dayanim, then it's fair to assume that even in the case of Asra, right, we have two possibilities. Either the Chacham determined that there's no Pesach, there's no charata, and therefore the neder is asur, or alternatively, he paskin that the neder is mutter, and the Chacham accepted and validated the what's it called, the Pesach or the charata. But both of those possibilities should be addressing the same case. Now, in the case of heter, he cannot be matter the neder, the Gemara is insisting, unless he has another two on the tribunal. Therefore, the case of Isa, the flip side, it should likewise be a case where there were three dayanim who determined we're rejecting the plea to disqualify the neder, to invalidate the neder based on Pesach or Karmah. And then we don't understand the Mishnah, because if there are three, then he should be able to marry her. And now in that case, what is the Mishnah saying? That if this Chacham determines that the neder is asur, he's not allowed to marry her. Michashidi. Let's put this together with the Sefer of our Mishnah. But Tanan, the Sefer says, Miano, Shecholzu Lefanav, Yisa Ena, Vipnei Shuv Bezdin. The Gemara says, Li'olam Bechad. The Mishnah is talking about a case where the Chacham is alone. It's a one-man show. And then we're going to have to introduce the concept of a Yochid Mumch. The Omer of Chizda, Omer of Yochanan, the Yochid Mumch. We're talking about a Baki. He knows the Talmud. He knows the Halacha. He's an expert in Hilchos Nedarim, and he can be Mater and Neder or Oser and Neder by himself without three. If he's a Yochid Mumcha, he doesn't have two other people, then we are choshed that the reason why he generated the Iser and Paskin, that this Neder is absolutely binding, is because he had vested interest and he wanted to marry us. We're not going to allow him to marry her. Otherwise, people are going to talk about, the Chachamim and so forth and so on. It's not going to be a pretty. Do you mind if I tell you a little story? You like stories? I mean, it's not going to add anything to our understanding of the Gemara. But in the old days, Rav Soloveitchik used to, at the end of the summer, he had what's called a Yarchei Kal for the Rabbinical Council of America. My father loved it. I mean, he would wait the whole year for those 3 days in Boston. Now, my father at that time was one of the big machas there, the Rabbinical Council. He was president. I don't know if this story took place during his presidency, but it doesn't matter. The Rav comes over to my father, and he says to him, Rabbi Berzon, get together another 2 rabbis. I want to be Mater Neder because I stand for Chazar Sashatz, and on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which is coming around the bend, I don't know if I'm going to be able to stand. So I need Hataras Nedarim. So my father was you have to know his sense of humor. My father was a bit of a jokester. He says to the Rav, he says, Rebbe, why do I have to get together another 2 Rabbanim? I'm a Yochid Mumcha. So the Rav said, I'll say it over in Yiddish and then I'll translate. He says, as du sein in a Yochid Mumcha Vesel, aber as ze sein in Hedyotos bin ich sicher. He said, now you have to understand the word Hedyo is like a little bit of a condescending word. So the Rav had a little bit of a, what should I say? A bit of a prejudice about American Rabbanim, that they call them Hedyotos. In other words, you need 3 Hedyotos. So I'm not sure if you, Rabbi Berzon, are Yochid Mumcha, but if you get together another 2 Rabbanim, I know for sure we have a tribunal of 3 Hedyotos. So the Mishnah says, Miano Shecholza. Then he's allowed to marry her time of the Bezdin because there are another 2 judges sitting on the bench. Habitshrei, lo. Okay, so now we have to introduce another element into the equation, that whenever the law requires a Bezdin, that means it's got to be more than 1 judge, but it doesn't necessarily have to be 3 judges. Now, l'chatchila, if all things are ideal, we're going to require 3 judges because we don't want an even number on a bezdin. That's called a bezdin shakal. So kidei shelo yeh bezdin shakal, we require a 3rd time. But let's say they went ahead and they gave a verdict, they delivered a verdict, and there were only 2 judges, but it was a unanimous decision. They both came to the same conclusion. And that's the case that the Gemara wants to be medayik from, that since there are only 2 judges, we're not going to allow either one of those judges after the miyun or after the chalitza to marry this woman because, again, we have a chashab. So if there are 3, so you're not going to be able to convince the other 2 to fabricate the truth and create a false decision based on the fact that one of the 3. But if there are 2 of them, he can tell his buddy, look, I really want to marry this girl. Help me out over here. So the Gemara says, Ma'ishno mehadisnan. But what are we going to do with the following Mishnah? Okay, now where is this Mishnah? Just give me a second. Gimel. Oh, it's a Mishnah Masechet Shabbat, I think. Just 1 second. Double check that. Do you have a note here where it's coming from? Wait a minute, Zion. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong letter here. Oh, in Gittin. I think it's a Mishnah in Gittin. Edim hachasumim al stay mekach. So you have what's called a bill of sale. We'll call it Ruvain selling a sada field to Shimon, and there are two witnesses signed on the bill of sale. That's case number one. Case number two, the al get isha. So Ruvain wrote a get to his wife Leah, and now he gets two witnesses to sign on the get. Lo chashu chachamim l'davar zeh. If, let's say, afterwards, one of the signatories, is there a word like that? Right? One of the signatories decides to buy this field or to marry this woman, then there's no chashat. In other words, we don't think that his testimony was a false testimony. Now, again, there are only two witnesses. And we just finished establishing that in the case of two witnesses, where there's smoke, there's fire, there's certain circumstantial evidence that seem to indicate that this was a bluff. And he only did this in order to be able to marry this woman. Our Mishnah says only when there's three judges sitting on the bench, then we're not choshesh for sheker. There's no chashad. But the implication was that if there are two, then maybe one convinced the other one, his buddy, and the whole thing was a fabrication. So the Gemara answers, no, even in the case of Shnayim, there's no chashad. And then we go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Mipnei shehu bezdin. So the Gemara says, even in the case of Shnayim, there's no chashad. He gufa kamachmalon lafuki miman diomar miyun b'fnei Shnayim kamachmalon miyun b'shlosha. The Mishnah only mentions shlosha as a side point to indicate that miyun requires a bezdin of shlosha. That's our law that we have to know. How many judges have to sit on a court to supervise, oversee a miyun? But as far as our halach is concerned, as to whether or not there's lazus fasayim and chashad, and whether he's allowed to marry this woman, there's no difference between two witnesses, two dayanim or three dayanim. Iboilahu kanas ma'u sheyotzi. The Mishnah says that in the first case, we have lazus fasayim. In other words, circumstances look like he was testifying falsely in order to marry this woman. Like, for example, the chacham who paskins that the neder is valid, it's absolutely binding, and she's also, and he can't get any hana from his wife, then he's not allowed to marry. Or, for example, we had in the previous Mishnah, if he testifies that her husband died, or he brings a get, in all those cases, we say that he's not allowed to marry her. Konas ma'u sheyotzi. He took the law into his hands, got together two witnesses, and he said, Hareyat Makudeshesli. He went ahead and he married this woman. Against the law. He wasn't allowed to do so. Umau sheyotzi. Should we force him to divorce his wife? And the Gemara quotes the Machlok. Rav Kahana Omar Konas Motzi. Rav Ashi Omar Konas Eino Motzi. Tani Lahura Suti to Bay Rav Papi. Allah So the Gemara is accepting the opinion of Rav Ashi that although lechatchilu we don't allow this marriage to take place, but once he changed the facts on the ground and he married her, we're not going to bust up the marriage. Amrulei Rabbanu Rav Ashi, Gemara o Svara. Svara means you have a logical reasoning that compels you to come to this conclusion, or Gemara, that's what you got from your ancestors. Omalahu, so Rav Ashi says the Chachamas Disani. I derive my conclusion from a Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah we learned back on Daf Chav Daled, Haniton Mishivka. The word was out about a certain man that he was living with a shifta, which is a violation of a lav dorais. Then afterwards, Nishtachara, her master gave her a get shifta. And now she's a Jewish girl. That completes her gerus. Another case. Me'ovedes kochav. Everybody's saying about this man that he's been living with a shiksa. And then his gaira, and then she converted. In all these cases, the Mishnah says, "Arezel yiknos im kanas eno motzios." Right, here's cases where there's lazus fasayin. Because why is he marrying her? He's marrying her because he was flirting with her, and worse, before the gerus, when she was still a non-Jewish woman. However, im kanas eno motz. Alma, we see from this, here we turn to the Chavav, Bernana lo mafkina. Bernana means lazus vasai. When there's a chashad going out, that we're not going to break up the marriage. Hachinami here too, if the chacham aser the neder, or let's say a person brought a get, or he testified that her husband died, then Bernana lo mafkina, that because of the renewed, the laws and the chashad, we're not going to break up the marriage. That's not enough of a reason to compel us to force him to divorce his wife. So this leads us to the Mishnah here, which is the last Mishnah in the second parak. On Daf Chavav Aminah. Okay, then so that's where we'll pick it up tomorrow. I wish you a great day and a meaningful fast.